Here we are on Train Talk Media. We are getting together with one of our most requested podcasts, Eric Pietrus, ladies and gentlemen, with Chicago Crossing Model Railroad. All right, before we get going, we want everybody right now that's watching this most requested podcast with Eric and Chicago Crossing to go in the comment section and put down, I want to win. Whether you subscribe or not while you're watching this, to win $50 in 3D printed modeling from John Chase, $50 at the end of the month, and then I think we're going to do it again in December. It's Eric, welcome to the podcast, and how did your journey in model railroading begin? Everybody that's been on says, my dad.
I'm going to bore you in that way because in some ways it is a little bit the same. There's two stories that get me to model railroads and model trains. The first is probably like a decent fraction of the folks who have been on your show and the folks who are watching it, is my dad had a Lionel, and that Lionel would come out usually around Christmas time, and it would go onto a plywood board. And that was the most fun thing for me in the world, was playing with that Lionel train. It only came out once a year, and not every year either. My dad was pretty fastidious with it. He, bought it with his grocery store money as a kid, and still had all the original boxes. And he loved that I would play with it, but he just wouldn't bring it out very often. He was a busy guy. I suppose he had some other things to do other than make sure that things didn't fall off the tabletop. Because to this day, I still derail more trains than I successfully drive. So I think that probably started all the way back with the Lionel. And, it's not like I run them too fast. I honestly don't know what happened. But so that was part number one. Part number two was where I grew up. I grew up in suburban Chicago, and specifically over in the LaGrange area, which is an intersection between the Burlington Northern and the Indiana Harbor Belt railways. And we lived pretty close when I was growing up to both of those rail lines. My parents commuted on the Burlington Northern into downtown for their jobs. My mom worked for a little while at Electromotive, actually, before I was born. And, in addition to that, I was a little kid, got to ride my bike down to the park over there. And you could actually just sit and watch the trains go by. So I would be, watching the old Indiana Harbor Belt SW7s back to back, moving cargo to and from wherever they were going at the time. I didn't really know where that was, but it was just a lot of fun to watch. And, you had just about every railway moving along those tracks because of the fact that it was just a larger belt line. The Burlington Northern, I used to go to a swimming pool in the summers that was right adjacent to the Burlington Northern Raceway, so the three parallel railroad tracks over there. And that was really cool because that was the day of the old SD40s, the big green giants moving transnational freight. And you'd see the B units without a cab. You'd see the fuel tenders in between them just to make sure that these trains could get to and from. It was a lot of fun. So you'd just see these long freight trains with piggyback service. At that time, containerization was still not quite a thing. And then you just have these big mixed manifests of just about everything. So that was, those were probably the formative years where I really got into trains and really just liked model railroads in general.
All right, so basically what drew you to focus on the Chicago area and that gritty South Side Chicago representation on Chicago Crossing?
Yeah, the time period that I model, and granted, you can see models on my layout with things like safety stripes, which clearly is a little bit later, but I kind of forgive myself some of my sins here. But I model the 80s and 90s. I lived in Chicago in the very early 2000s in the city, but, the 90s, especially when I was in college and high school, those were the times where I really got around to just explore the city and explore the urban industrial locations and things like this. And when I worked and lived in Chicago, I took CTA everywhere. So I got to explore all these nooks and crannies and just sort of live in the industrial world of Chicago. That had a big impact on me. And when I, decided that I was actually going to get serious about model railroading, that was the sort of thing that needed to be modeled, because that's the thing I knew. I've always felt that we do our best model railroading when we model things that we know and that we have like a really keen attachment to, because then I just think it provides that little extra passion that helps to actually create a scene and bring it alive, and to create a railroad and bring it alive.
So how long have you been working on this project? Well, except for the 10 months you spent under the layout, which we'll talk about later.
Yeah, that's its own story, right? So Chicago Crossing is actually kind of an interesting story, I suppose. And, I consider myself in many ways a bit of an accidental hobbyist, and I'll explain what I mean by that. When I was a kid, I really didn't have, the ability to build a model railroad. I remember once taking some sectional track and putting it in a figure eight with a little bridge and then running the trains on the floor and watching the trains rip the track apart and deciding, maybe my time was best spent building military models and things like that. And so that's more or less what I spent my youth doing. I really didn't spend a lot of it doing any sort of model railroading. I put all that stuff down when I got into high school. I had other things that I needed to do. And I really didn't think about model trains deeply again until later in my career, when I was, starting as an assistant professor at the university that I work at. And at that time, quite frankly, I, number one, didn't think I had the time, and number two, didn't think I had the wherewithal to ever bother building a model railroad. But I liked model trains. So what I decided to do is I actually had somebody just build a partially finished track plan. And I picked out the track plan. It was, what you see on the layout, except that track plan was originally just a point-to-point track plan that I found on the internet. I don't even remember where. And this is what I mean about accidental hobbyist. There are many people who are very, very deliberate about what they do, and they start from the beginning and they move all the way through. It was never my thought and never my plan that I would ever get serious about model railroading, have a YouTube channel about it, think about track plans or anything like that. The track plan that I chose, the reason I chose that is simply it had a river and it had some bridges, and I thought, that sort of reminds me of parts of Illinois that I used to grow up in and that I used to spend time in, not even parts that were necessarily Chicago. The very original sketch that I sent to the individual who built the track work and just the basic plywood for that layout, I said, I'm going to build a layout that looks like it's running from like Joliet, Illinois to Lamont, Illinois. Suburbs of Chicago, outer area of Chicago, even areas like Western Illinois. And so, what I got out of that was basically a partially finished layout with a little bit of rock work and a river and stuff like that. And so for about 2 years, what I did is I just built some kit buildings. I put them on there, and I was like, okay, I can run trains, especially after stressful days running a laboratory. This was kind of like my little escape. I could work on it in a really informal way. I built some Walthers buildings to a decent enough standard, and I said, good enough. It wasn't until about 2 years later, so this would have been around 2019, I got bored with this. And I realized, number one, I was making no progress. Number two, the layout didn't actually fit what it really was that I was interested in. I'd built all these different industrial kits, and they were sitting in an area that looked like, at best, maybe Dubuque, Illinois. And that is, it's got industrial areas, but none of this made sense to me. And at that point, I started to actually finally think deliberately about what it is that I wanted to do. And I think that's when the transition happened from somebody with a model railroad to being a model railroader, and to deciding that if I wanted to actually have fun at this, then it needed to be a hobby for me and not just a point to go downstairs and build a couple kits and run some trains. And so that's when I started to actually rip everything apart on that layout and build it the way that I wanted it to be. And that really is the story of Chicago Crossing. In many ways, it's not necessarily something that was built entirely from scratch. Rather, it's almost a reverse engineering or a complete remodel of something that I had in my basement that I felt that it wasn't worth just completely getting rid of. I didn't want to sell it, and I don't have room to build 2 layouts down there. So rather, it was a way to repurpose something and to actually take the time to learn what it is that I want to do as a hobbyist, and to start to strive for excellence and to learn how to do things in a way that makes me feel satisfied as a hobbyist. So like I say, I'm an accidental hobbyist. It was never my intention to actually have a railroad that would be something any more than just a thing with some buildings, much like my dad's Lionel, that would run some trains. It wasn't until I got bored with what I had that I decided it was really time to level up and to take a completely different approach to that railroad.
Yeah, I remember it's been about a couple of years. Quiz me on this, 3 or 4 years since you've popped on the scene with your YouTube channel that has taken off tremendously, right?
Yeah, surprisingly, right? I
Yeah,
had
and
no idea.
When I first saw the layout, I go, oh, this is cool. I like this because let me tell you what, because it is so filled with urban grit and grime and the complexity of urban Chicago in it, you don't see that it is a lot of track. But because of all the structures, the river, the tunnel, and a few key landscape scenes that offset all the track, the track seems to work. You don't necessarily have to have, like Lance Bendheim calls it, negative space. You have to have the complexity and the selective compression when doing a layout like this.
You absolutely do, and it's great that you bring up Lance, because between Lance Bendheim and Bill Denton, these days, those 2 individuals are probably my biggest influences in terms of how to reapproach model railroading as a true hobby and as a way to, progress to excellence on my own layout. Chicago Crossing didn't end up hitting YouTube until I felt that I had basically ripped it apart enough to where it was actually a reflection of my own art rather than the original builder of the base of that layout. And I think what that meant for me was that I had already essentially torn apart and completely remodeled probably about 70% of the surface area at that point. I had to redo the river. I spilled paint in it. Don't do that.
Ouch.
And resin and Mod Podge don't go well together.
It would have been prototypical of the Chicago River on St. Patrick's Day. Was it green paint?
No, sadly, it was flat earth. The thing I airbrush and blend all of my stuff with. So yeah, sadly enough, that didn't work very well. And at that point I was like, well, I guess I could try to put a boat over it, but I actually just ended up taking it all apart and redoing it. But the thing that I talk about sometimes on my channel, and I think this is really important because for me this was the step between, again, kind of the guy with the model railroad and actually becoming a model railroader. The first thing that I redid on that layout was to scrape away a bunch of turf and for the first time just lay down a large concrete pad where all of those industries are that you see over on what would be the stage left side of the layout. So that's the Pickens Keene warehouse and the grain mill and stuff like that. And I remember thinking to myself, okay, Eric, you're going to do it, and you're either going to end up with something that is worse than what was there, or you're going to end up with something better than what was there. But at least you've just got to do it. And, it's why I say it, no fear, it's just a hobby, because that's literally true. And, as I scraped away that original turf layer, not only did I sort of learn a little bit about how to get turf down and what to make it look good as, but it just prompted that burn the boats at the shore sort of attitude. Hey, if you're going to get better, you just got to get rid of the things that are not helping you to get better. And so that was the big first step, is putting down that concrete pad. And after that, more and more material basically got scraped away and completely redone to make it an urban layout from what was before, kind of just like a suburban sort of forested layout. But, to come back to your point about negative space, that's a really big thing too. There's a big area full of trees over there, and probably a lot of that'll be remodeled because there's some rock faces there that don't belong there. But nonetheless, negative space is a huge deal with model railroading, because with something as compressed and as dense as Chicago Crossing on a 7x3, you really have to make sure that you can just kind of rest your eyes a little bit as you kind of scan over all this stuff, because otherwise it can be such a cluttered mess. Lance Mindheim is spot on when he talks about the fact that you can't have too much in there, because eventually you just don't know where to look, and you just can't make anything special anymore.
Well, we got the king of negative space on next week, Grant Eastman, Southern Alberta Railroad, and it is such an awesome layout, and it's so open and wide and scenic vistas and views, and it's just amazing. You're aware of his layout, of course.
Absolutely, yeah. No, I mean, at some point, as you start to get your head out of the sand and you realize how big of a community there is, then absolutely, you start to become aware of all of your colleagues on YouTube or not, who have just absolutely splendid model railroads.
And then the goat, Boomer. Boomer is our goat.
Yeah.
And by the way, I argued with him the other day. I said, Boomer, you're the one that convinced me to do this podcast and talk to all these great modelers. You're going to come on it. So he said after the first of the year. So I'm like, finally. Have we not learned so much from him? I mean, he's like absolutely, he's Yoda. And he's a Star Wars freak, so when I call him Yoda, he doesn't mind.
Yeah,
learn
Boomer
from me, you will. Learn from me, you will.
And learn from him, I did.
Yes,
and
we all
I think
did.
all of us did.
We all did.
It's amazing when you look at the individuals in the YouTube community who have worked really hard to make YouTube a phenomenal resource. You look at Larry Puckett, you look at you look at Boomer. These are great examples of people who can, teach you how to wire a layout and to know everything about electronics, or to know everything that there is about scenery. Where Boomer for me was always a really big influence is early on when I was busy, lifting up all of the old turf and trying to actually make my layout look realistic. What he was doing in HO, I then worked to try to understand how best to do an N scale. And, there's a big difference between HO and N.
Yeah.
But a lot of those techniques are applicable. You just have to kind of think about, how do I actually miniaturize the scale of what somebody like Boomer does, and then be able to do it successfully in 1/160th scale. One of my favorite example of this is what I call Boomer barrels. So Boomer had a wonderful episode about how to make rusted 55-gallon drums.
Yep.
And I remember that because I went right downstairs and I was like, I've got some 3D printed drums that need rusted lids and labels on them and things like that. Let's see if I can actually get this done in N scale. And the answer is absolutely you can. The brushes are way tinier. The magnification is way more. But
you can't read them. You can't read anything on the barrels.
A sharp-eyed person actually saw on when I was showing my little example of Boomer barrels on an update. He said, "Well, that's not quite the right UN symbol for what you would have in there."
Magnifying glass eyes there.
And then I was like, I'm. People like that, for me, are always so helpful because people are paying attention, somebody's looking, and you learn something. That person was a professional truck driver. They haul all sorts of stuff. And so, at that point, you've got a photographic memory of what every different container might be and what all of those quadrilateral symbols might actually mean. So, folks like that become really helpful to me because they help as a grounding influence to really see, can I dive in and make this correct? There will never be enough days in my lifetime to get everything to be 100% prototypical, and I'll never be a true rivet counter when it comes to this, because in some ways that sort of, works against some of the artistry and the artistic license that one always has to take with a model railroad. But there are certain areas where somebody tells me that, challenge received, I will do it. And so that was one of those great examples where I'm like, I'm going to go back and I'm going to relabel those tiny little 55-gallon drums so that it looks right.
Here at Train Talk Media, we're proud to be powered by Whistle Stop Models. Welcome to Whistle Stop Models, where they bring your model railroad dreams to life. As a premier provider of custom-designed N-scale buildings, structures, details, and in all scales, too, they're passionate about creating highly detailed and realistic structures and detail parts that will elevate your layout to new heights. So no matter what your scale is, they cater to enthusiasts of all train scales, offering a comprehensive range of 3D printed models. Whether you're a dedicated HO scale modeler or prefer the intricate world of Z scale, they've got something to enhance your miniature railroad. And we're proud here at Train Talk Media to support Whistle Stop Models. If you go to the comments below and put in "I want to win," you're officially in for a drawing at the end of November in just a couple of weeks to win $50 of 3D printed parts from the catalog from Whistle Stop Models. Remember, in the comments, "I want to win." All right, so Chicago railroading has that unique industrial look that you've captured. Just absolutely awesome. How do you achieve that atmosphere with the structures and weathering? You go into it a lot on your channel, but for folks checking us out right here that haven't got there yet, and vice versa for those who have seen it, kind of a refreshing thing if they didn't quite catch one of the portions of a video where you talked about it.
Right. There's a few different things that go into weathering and creating industrial grit. I think the first and foremost is memory is fallible. And so for me, photographs are everything. I probably have a second hobby of trolling the internet, either through historical archives, Flickr, Railroad Archive, and also just Google Maps and Google Earth, especially using the kind of time machine function where you can look back at previous iterations of Google Street View. Right. And I use that as my inspiration. Some of the best layouts that you see out there, you notice that when somebody's building a section, and Boomer is very much the same in this way, you see photographs of prototype taped to the wall. And that's how you really get the look is number one, you basically just look at what you're actually looking for to begin with. And then number two is really the interpretation. So how is it that you can actually use, the tools that you have in order to try to come up with the same type of weathering or the same type of urban grit that you're actually looking for? And, that's a process of experimentation. That's what I've found. I don't always get it right, but what I learn is how to do about 3 or 4 different things really, really well, so I know what they can be used for. Things like chipping techniques, things like wet on wet approaches or washes, and kind of fine tuned sorts of painting and filtering with airbrushes. You don't need a huge palette of either resources, supplies, or techniques in order to get something to look right. What you really just need is you need to be able to translate an image or a place into something that gives somebody the appropriate impression of that at the detail level that your particular scale of railroading can actually facilitate. So for me, that's really the key, is basically how do I create that atmosphere? And it really is just a mix of about 5 different techniques that I use on a regular basis, and occasionally a little bit of additional experimentation thrown in. I think novelty seeking and trying new things is always a great way to sort of level up in the hobby. For me, that's been all of what it's been about. But, having a playbook of a few really, really good approaches that you learn and that you test in different ways is the backbone of being able to successfully weather and detail any kind of structure or kit or terrain.
So what are some challenges of modeling urban scenes and tight spaces realistically, especially with all your warehouses, your manufacturing plant? You got a brewery in there?
There are 2 big challenges, I think. Number one is the challenge of compression, which all of us have as model railroaders. And it's true for any type of model or diorama. The second is the scale. And I talk about this in a video that discusses the sort of issue of fine scale modeling and how that filters down particularly to smaller and smaller scales where essentially resolution begins to be a problem. I use the example of, can I in N scale model a glass sitting on a table? And the answer, that might be kind of tough. You potentially could, but is that actually going to be meaningful to a scene? So let's take both of those things kind of in order. Compression, number one, I will never be able on that layout to model a complete industry. And this is true for many of us who are not modeling, say, a switching layout that runs, for an entire brewery. You can look at some great model railroads like the Milwaukee Beer Line as a great example of what happens if you use compression in a way where you model the entire industry, but at the same time just keep the distances from that to, say, the rail yard relatively short.
He's done a great job with that, too, because most of it is siding and yard switching before the brewery, which is down the line, right?
Exactly. And, a good example of that out here in Colorado is if you drive over by Golden, you can see the Coors Brewery. Mm-hmm. And that in and of itself is a massive shelf switching layout if somebody wished to make it so. It's amazing how big those operations are, right? So you have to basically pick your battles as to where it is that you want to accentuate and where it is that you want to compress. And this is something that is different for everybody in terms of how they, quote unquote, fight that battle, so to speak.
Yeah, I remember some of the old Kalmbach model railroader magazines or books that were published 10 to 20 years ago. Do you remember when they did features on layouts that had a structure, many structures or buildings or a complex off the layout with maybe just a siding go into it with a gate across the siding?
What I'm looking for is basically what is the key visual element? I mean, Chicago is full of small warehouses. And so that's really what I try to work with. The Pickens Cane warehouse, which currently is represented by a modified Walters kit, is probably about 5 times larger in depth than what you see. But there's literally no way that I could fit that on a layout that in general is trying to model a couple of key industrial parts of the city. So at that point, what you're really looking for is almost an impressionistic approach to modeling. What is the minimum necessary in order for somebody to really understand what this is and what it's for? And so that is the key aspect of compression. So is that the Pickens Cane's warehouse? Yeah, in spirit, much the same way that the Cassidy Tires building is, probably maybe about the same size as the Cassidy Tires building, but it doesn't have all the associated garages and parking lots and things like that the real prototype had. You have to basically distill something down to an essence of what it actually is. The second element about scale is, of course, really important because some details work really well and some details don't. For me, part of the fun of working in N scale is actually figuring that out from an experimental point of view. Model railroading is a lot of experimentation. So there are scenes where I have, gone as far as to model individual cardboard boxes laying open by a dumpster. And, that it's an interesting detail. Likewise, I've actually, used toaster wire to model concertinas of barbed wire on the fence over where that scrapyard is. Those are not necessarily easy elements to model, and not everybody is able to do that either with dexterity or eyesight. Mine, by the way, is not getting any better as I get older. So I probably should make all the cardboard boxes and concertina wire I want to do right now so that it's just there. But at the same time, for me, am I going to put cardboard boxes everywhere? Not necessarily, but for things like garbage or dumpsters or industrial, refuse or detritus or whatever it is, being selective about where that is and making sure that it fits within this concept of a diorama is really important. So again, this comes back to folks like Lance Minheim, who would make an argument that not everything should be full of stuff, and that working to identify little scenic areas of focus where the viewer can find the little treasures and Easter eggs and then be able to move on to that next scene, that becomes really, really important. And in N scale, you can't do as much as you can in HO, but that's both a blessing and a curse. It's a compromise.
It's really funny that you say that because I'm just sitting here thinking that you're absolutely right. You need to do less in N scale where you think you do more, because if you look at a super detailed scene in N scale, it looks better if maybe just a couple of spare tires and maybe a bike up against a fence.
But the funny thing is, I pick my battles. There are some things, like the horn chimes on many of my locomotives that are, ready to run and a prototypical, and I'm like, whatever. Fire hydrants? No, that has to be a proper Chicago fire hydrant. You know, it's amazing to the extent to which we are sometimes selectively blind to details that other people will be absolutely, point on. And to me, that's the beauty of a hobby that is as big and extensive as it is. But, coming back to your point about details, absolutely. Visual overload is just a few misplaced things away. And I think one has to be really careful about what it is that you put on your layout, because not everything belongs in every place. Sometimes it's enough to just leave the impression. This is, that fine scale modeler's dilemma video I made. It starts out with a view of an impressionistic painting. Why? Because that's what model railroading is at any scale. And the smaller the scale, the more that it truly is impressionistic. And the deeper you zoom in, sometimes the less can really be there.
See, that's the video I saw, and I said, he's Boomer's boyfriend. Those two are cut from the same cloth when I saw that, because Boomer did that there was a couple of episodes, and I can't remember, it was just between Glover Road and River Road, maybe a year or so into it, when he did the same thing and talked about art, and I go and talked about painters and stuff, and it's absolutely true.
Yeah, of course for me, the impressionistic painting I'm going to choose is the one that's over at the Art Institute of Chicago, the La Jetée painting, which is a fantastic one. In any case, yeah, I think all of us work with that compromise, and that's fine. At the end of the day, like, these are models. I think the beauty of model railroading is that it's something in miniature, and there's the inherent magic of miniatures that all of us get to enjoy. And so from that standpoint, even if it's never going to be 100% real or prototypical or deep down into that resolution, it's magic, man. That's why I like N scale so much. It's amazing that these things run around a track and make sound and look the way they do. It's amazing that there are details out there, especially in the era of 3D printing, that you can actually add to a layout. Everything looks amazing when it's tiny like that. And I think that's been so much of the fun of this experience. The big reason that N scale is what I have chosen is really because of Bill Denton and his layout.
Yeah.
I saw that when I was a teenager, and it turns out, actually, because when I posted the video about actually meeting Bill and seeing the layout again, a bunch of people wrote back that, hey, yeah, I saw that layout in the mid-'90s over at the Lyons Township Train Show. And I was like, yeah, in that case, you and I were probably standing next to each other, except I was 12, you were whatever age you were, and we were all gawking at this amazing rendition of industrial Chicago that to this day still serves as my kind of, lodestar in the distance of what I hope to, make Chicago Crossing more and more like in spirit and in quality. That layout to me really is what drove home the idea that N scale is a phenomenal place for switching layouts. It is a phenomenal scale for small layouts, and it's a phenomenal scale for detail work, because Bill accomplished all of that within that layout and within a relatively small space.
See if my memory's right. It is the Chicago Northwestern, and I'm not looking anything up, Kingsbury, right?
Yeah, the Kingsbury branch, and in that case, Milwaukee Road is the primary
okay, it was the road. It wasn't CNNW. See, I wasn't.
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah. No, that layout is an absolute gem. It is amazing to see.
Let's get into community and inspiration now. What other modelers, and we've talked about this, we're still talking about it now with Mr. Denton. What other modelers or layouts have inspired your work?
Yeah, I'd say it's a relatively limited palette, but especially because of the small layout genre and the fact that many layouts tend to be these larger, sort of basement size or club size layouts that you see. So really, folks who are running small shelves and small switching layouts, those folks tend to be kind of my people in terms of lifting inspiration and lifting ideas. And so that's why in many ways, like, Bill does have a pretty outsized impact on what I perceive as what I can do with Chicago Crossing and in inspiration for my layout. I would certainly say, on top of that, we've talked about Boomer. Yeah, I mean, Boomer, again, exists as kind of a big inspiration to all of us. And I think what he has done to, further popularize and also to advocate for the concept of the shelf switching layout is really, really timely. because I think we are at a stage where a lot of people are interested in model railroading and also maybe more interested in being able to build these kind of smaller, highly detailed layouts and things like that. Beyond that, I mean, modeling and model railroading is a big hobby. And earlier in the 2020s, when I was starting to think seriously about what types of skills I wanted to acquire, weathering rail cars was another big one. JC's Rip Track. JC, he was a big influence.
That guy's awesome.
He is, absolutely fantastic modeler, right? Coming from the miniatures world and moving into model railroading as well, and using a lot of these same techniques and doing so in a way that was like very clearly explained and really well done. I studied his videos deeply. So again, another big influence. Larry Puckett, for me, a huge influence when it comes to thinking, conscientiously about the electronics and wiring of models and how to do things right.
He's OG too, because he was like one of the first, because it was still, the DCC guy with his model railroader vest on, and the videos have been on a while, and he's still doing it. He's the godfather.
Yeah, absolutely. Before he was doing YouTube, he was writing books on the topic, right? And then of course, Shepard Payne, who is another, famous diorama artist, actually from the Chicago area. For me is a huge influence, because when I was doing military modeling, I would rent out Shepard Payne's books from the local library, and I would study those images as I was trying to likewise create my 135th or 176th scale, military dioramas, some of the scenes and some of the concepts that he was working with. So, Shep Payne plays an outsized role in my thinking about model railroading, because the diorama concept is really, really important for model railroads where there's a lot of selective compression, and particularly in my case where I've got a loop where you can potentially see the entire layout if you aren't careful about how you block views or how you direct viewers to particular stories. So I think moving even outside of model railroading and into military modeling and miniatures in general, there has been a lot of influence from that community as well, and I think that's great. Hobbies like model railroading are truly multidisciplinary, and there's a lot of people that you can learn from, even if they're not necessarily working on trains. That's
very true. Interesting point. I'm doing a side project called the Norfolk Southern Danville Secondary. It's not too far from Chicago. It's like 50, 60 miles south in a town called Schneider, Indiana. And it's a long story, but you can read about it. I have a Facebook page for it called the NS Danville Secondary, and that's where I'm putting most of the pictures up. 16 inches by 52 inches. So I got an interesting comment from Andreas Gosner. Says, when I get into the situation to rework or rebuild my layout, I'm going to cut it down, tracks and switches, make it simple, like here, showing this project I'm doing. That's really enough for 30 to 60 minutes of prototypical switching on the two industry tracks. I've literally wasted a lot of money on track switches and rolling stock.
Oh, 100%. And the model railroad diorama, I think is a great genre that I think, there are some people out there really starting to explore. I'm sure there have been people exploring that concept for years. But again, in smaller spaces and in smaller bites, these sort of things are fantastic. I pen pal with an individual out in Wisconsin named Andy, who is an active HO diorama builder. And he makes these lovely detailed structures and hand scenic elements going all the way down to the painting of the ties and things like this, where you can really focus and dig in on these minute and really enjoyable details without worrying that you're going to have a plywood Pacific for years and years and years and years.
Yeah.
The reality is, to have fun in model railroading, you may need nothing more than a single turnout small layout that you can move something back and forth on. There's a relatively new modeler who has just started a YouTube channel who's modeling a very small part of the Chicago Metro rail yard. It's another great example of in this case, I think it's just like a 1x3 layout that will mostly be involved of switching Metra cars to and from different parts of the yard. I mean, these are genius concepts because they bring model railroading down to a really scalable prospect where one doesn't need hundreds of train cars or one doesn't need, hundreds of square feet of space. Anybody can do so in an apartment. And I think, affordability and scalability become really important for being able to make sure that the hobby is, truly accessible and enjoyable for a lot of different people.
All right. Well, looking ahead, what upcoming projects, expansions, or new ideas are you working on? Now it's time. It's time to talk about. Oh man! And where did you learn wiring? I want to hire you as a chief engineer of a radio station. I was telling Michelle Kemper last week because she was talking about the electronic expansion they have to go through at the Colorado Model Railroad Museum, and I said, bring Eric in. I said, there's no spaghetti. Everything has a place, and it looks wonderful. I'll put some pictures up of this right now, man. Brother label maker served its purpose, right?
It sure did. I went through probably a few yards of label making tape doing that, to the point where maybe people might accuse me of being overly fastidious with labeling. I say, no, man, you want to know where something goes, just put a label on it and let it stick there, and you're going to be happy for a longer period of time. The inspiration for this was twofold. Number one is finding that suddenly I had streetlights that weren't working anymore, and I couldn't figure out why. And then number two, connected to that, lifting up the layout after a couple of years, after I'd done the initial, night lighting CCMR at night project, as I called it, lifting up the layout and being like, what the hell is this under here? Oh my God. I can't, have a model railroad and have this be my wiring scheme. I'm never going to be able to fix or modify anything.
So when it originally built it, you were just stacking on, right?
Exactly. I had ripped out some very old school streetlight wiring when I had done the initial rewiring nighttime rewiring project. And then basically, here I was just kind of bolting different terminal blocks and light hubs and things like that to random places in the layout, had wires running to and from. And, eventually I just got kind of exhausted. And so I said, okay, I'm done. And I put the thing down and never had to look at it again. And then I picked it up again a couple of years later to do something underneath to deal with this lighting issue. And I was like, I have no idea what's under here. This just isn't going to work anymore. And so my New Year's resolution, so to speak, was, all right, it's time to do better than this. This is the last vestige of original layout. It was, the DCC wiring was solid enough, but it was made for somebody who's never going to change that or never going to add on to it, right? But here I am working to try to add on to this layout and to really build it into something that I want it to be. So I said, well, if I'm going to create, first I've got to destroy. And just like when I, took the first, first kind of whack at the original scenery on that layout, same sort of thing. The first cuts to those wires, man, it feels real. You've just turned it into a static display for some period of time. All right, burn the ships at the shore. Time to get going.
I saw that video, and when you made that first cut, it looked like it got easier. You just kept going. The first one is always the hardest one, and that's why I say in that layout update, you've done the hardest part now. Everything else is easier because all you need to do is to do something better than what you did. But, this to me, somebody might say, Eric, there's no reason that you actually needed to rewire that. You probably could have found that little bug and then just put the thing back down. Why are you sitting in what somebody called, and I love this term, the spider's domain of the model railroad? And, the answer is, because for me, model railroading, it's an aspirational thing. Nobody has to copy what I do, nor do I ever intend anybody to do that. I don't need a bunch of people ripping apart their model railroads because Eric did. But rather, for me, it's a way to say, how can I do this better, and how can I explore the hobby in ways that previously I may not have really thought were germane to my existence? I've always been a good painter. Maybe I'm not an electronics guy. Well, it didn't take very long until I realized that with the help of a wonderful community of YouTubers and commenters, I learned a lot about electronics and wiring and things like that. There are people who are plumbers and electricians who are leaving comments about, this is how I think about things in my trade.
And I took all of that to heart because I'm a knowledge seeker, and that's what those comments provide is a lot of interesting knowledge and experience given from other people. So with those gifts, what you can do is you can learn how to do better and essentially, work as a crowdsourced sort of way. Without the inspiration of the people in my community, I don't know that I would have done half as good of a job, because they are the ones who can provide the prompts and just the insight from experience into how best to do this. And then you try to synthesize that into something that ends up being a project that ends up better than what that layout originally had. So yeah, that was a masterclass in at least some aspects of model railroad electronics. And I will say it is an incomplete masterclass in the sense that there's still so much more out there to learn. I don't know that I'll ever be building diode relays to, run switches and things like that underneath there. But there's a part of me that just wants to make one at some point just for the fun of it and just to see. And I never thought I'd get into electronics in that way. It just wasn't my thing. But now it is. And so you level up and you learn that there's so much more interesting stuff in that hobby than you ever necessarily appreciated to begin with.
These are all modern connections. I mean, this is almost solderless, right? They're all suitcase connectors and clips, pretty much.
And about 400 solder joints.
That I didn't see. But I'll tell you what I saw this boy has. That was really cool. That plastic piece that's got a couple of wood screws up into the frame that holds some main wires, maybe some bus wires like a circle. I'm like, oh, this looks way cool. It looked like a catenary for a reverse catenary for electric railroad. You know where I'm talking about underneath.
I know exactly
right?
what you're talking about. Yeah, those standoffs. Yeah, necessity and some plastruck tubing are the mothers of invention. What can I say?
All right, so a couple of things here. Let's talk about DCC concepts. That is very cool. That's what's controlling the turnouts. Now,
it is, yeah.
What's on the other side between the actual turnout? You use Pico, right? Pico turnouts?
Yeah, those are Pico turnouts controlled by MTB switch motors.
Oh, okay. And then the connection is made to the DCC concepts keyboard. I want keyboard. Yeah, so is that a proper term?
Yeah, I guess what you could call it is just a remote controller. I don't really know what the precise term of that little box is.
Well, it's a modern day Atlas selector.
That's a good way to describe it. Yeah, I could go with that. I could go with that. Absolutely. So it's a lovely little device. Once again, my hat tip is to Larry Puckett, because he demonstrated that a couple of years ago on his small British style layout. And so that's where I picked that up, because I was thinking to myself, what do I want to do for a switch controller? Because number one, I knew I wanted DCC controllable turnouts. Number two, I didn't want a bunch of fascia switches. And number three, I was looking for something that just kind of fit with the, sort of sleek and modernist element of Chicago Crossing. That thing ticked all the boxes. I had otherwise been considering whether or not I was going to use maybe some of the DCC concepts kit stuff to just build my own control box. And yeah, I thought about fabricating that, but I also thought about, the time spent doing that versus being able to get something that actually has more buttons than I have turnouts that will ever need controlling seems like a pretty good deal. I can get that, plug it in, and be able to do everything I need to do and still have room for when I expand the layout over on the right side of it. So yeah, it was a really nice, simple solution, and for me, it works pretty well.
Okay, a couple of other things. I really love the fact that the entire 3x7 layout is on a steel table with rollers, so you can roll it out and work on the other side. That is so awesome.
Yeah, once again, born of necessity. That layout is literally as wide as
all
the room.
Of them in a circle. And you roll it out, and there you go. You can get to the other side.
Is
that was
proof
cool.
of concept for what one can do. Again, I treat the hobby in an aspirational way, and for me, there's not an expectation that excellence in the hobby means that anybody needs to mount anything in a server rack. It's more, can I do this? Likewise, I mean, nobody needs to be using these big Canon plugs in order to run electricity from their layout to and from. But given the electronic structure of my layout with a number of different voltage buses, to me, it just made the most sense in terms of how to do so in a compact and clean way. And then, I just took a hole saw and drilled a hole through a rack face in order to mount the other end into the server. And that was pretty much it. So, yeah, the nice thing is I just had a visitor who's actually a viewer come out. They were in Denver and wanted to see the layout with their son. So he came over with his son, and I could roll that rack over into the other little room where the laundry machine is and have it out of the way so nobody's going to trip on it or anything like that. So, sometimes having a little more cable than you need is not a terrible thing. And if I take this layout out of the basement and take it to a train show here in Denver, then it's another good way to just have everything in one spot that I can roll to wherever that layout needs to be located. And it just keeps things real simple.
How do you see your modeling evolving over the next few years? Boy, I don't think it could get any more serious and more extensive than it's been.
It can.
I built a layout that runs itself. I built a layout that I use ESP to run the trains and throw the turnouts. I just have to think it and it happens.
There may be a day where a lot of us have chips in our heads. Who the heck knows, right? There's actually a lot of evolution, both to the layout and also to, for me in the hobby. I'm serious, and people sometimes think that this is disingenuous, and I'm not trying to be. I'm still really at the beginning stages of being a model railroader. There are people with decades of experience out there building wonderful model railroads. If you look at the number of years that I've actually been serious about this hobby in any given way, it's about 6 years. So that's really been, a wonderful trajectory in learning a lot within 6 years. And what it tells me is that there's a lot yet to learn. I don't have all the answers for everything, and there's still a lot in the hobby that I have not done. And I think it's always, YouTube is one of those sorts of things where people can, potentially look at you as somebody that you're not because they don't see the blooper reel. And I've got a blooper reel that's probably longer than all of my, footage. But I'm not perfect in the hobby and I don't know everything. And there's a lot yet to know because true mastery is born over decades of serious and extensive and deep work within that field. That's why, somebody like Boomer, you can easily describe Boomer as a master because he has lived in that world for years and for his career and his hobby. So, that is a long route. For me as a scientist, that's something I do have mastery over. And that is because I spent 25 years of training in order to get to the point where I am in terms of my actual career. If I had spent that doing model railroading, it would be a different world. So I'm at the early stages of my own evolution. And for that reason, the number of different projects that'll happen on Chicago Crossing are extensive. I mean, there's more track to rip out and rearrange. There's an L-shaped extension so I can have a more Kingsbury-like switching side of the layout that will mesh nicely with the available space that I've got. Most people, for all sorts of reasons, are really excited about me removing those tunnels off of the layout, which, hey, I'm excited too, because, that literally is the last vestige of the original layout are those tunnels. And when those are gone, then Chicago Crossing really is much more a reflection of Chicago and of what I mean that layout to really be. So those will come off. I have a reciprocating tool to pull those things off of there. It's the old school chicken wire underneath.
Oh, and, you went old school. You didn't even do plaster cloth or newspaper or
no foam or any of that.
Or David Ferry cardboard webbing with hot glue from the gun dripping on your fingers.
And I think that will probably be the most viewer satisfaction I've ever gotten out of the channel because, I even remember I put on the layout update and I said, you can move the packing table away so I can get underneath and remove that tunnel. And somebody wrote, and I almost wonder if they were worried. They're like, but you're going to remove that other tunnel, right? And I was like, yeah, man, don't panic. I'm gonna get both of them at some point.
Well, Eric, this has been just absolutely fantastic. Like I said earlier in the beginning, we had a lot of requests to have you on. Your channel is blowing up. Your layout is phenomenal. Your electrical prowess is next level. Thank you so much for being on the Train Talk Media podcast with us and continued success. And by the way, don't blow anything up in the lab.
Thankfully, we don't work with too many things that would do that. So I'll try not to. That way the channel will keep running too. Chuck, it's been a real pleasure, man. Thanks for having me on as a guest, and I really appreciate it.